The case of Lucy Letby is one of the most horrific cases in years. She was recently convicted of murdering 7 babies and trying to kill 6 others, making her the most prolific child killer in Great Britain. As shocking as this case is, it's not the first time a British nurse murdered the babies and young children under her care. I'm talking about Beverley Allitt. Let's get into it. Hi folks, and welcome to my channel. Thank you so much for spending time with me. If you're new here, my name is Delaney and I'm a true crime writer and, well, murder nerd. On this channel, I like to take deep dives into the worst cases. And I tend to cuss a lot. So, if that sounds like your idea of a good time, go ahead and subscribe. You can also support me by joining my membership or Patreon, where you'll get early access to videos, bonus content, and more. Now I want to take a look at the cases of Lucy Letby and Beverley Allitt, 2 very similar angel of death cases. So if you don't know, an angel of death is a healthcare worker, usually a nurse, but sometimes a doctor or even a respiratory therapist, who murders their patients. Psychologists prefer to call them by the more straightforward name, medical serial killers. Medical serial killers are pretty rare. You've probably heard about the big cases like Charles Cullen, Dr. Harold Shipman, or Jolly Jane Toppin. They usually prey on the elderly, so their crimes look like deaths from natural causes, making them especially hard to catch. But it's even rarer for a medical serial killer to target babies and children. There was Janine Jones, Beverley Allitt, and more recently, Lucy Letby. If you haven't already heard about this case, there's a ton of good info out there. I recommend the BBC's extremely in-depth coverage of the case. But just to recap, Lucy Letby was born in 1990 and grew up in Hereford in a 2-parent household with no reports of abuse or any other issues. She was apparently popular in school because she made several friends who are close with her up until this day. They describe her as kind, gentle, and shy, but once you got to know her, she could be goofy and bubbly. There haven't been any reports of her lying or faking illnesses or injuries for attention or mental health issues, and no record of her committing violence, before this anyway. She attended the University of Chester and studied nursing. During that time, she had several work placements, mostly at the Countess of Chester Hospital, either on the children's ward or the neonatal unit. When she qualified as a nurse in September 2011, she was hired on full-time at the hospital, then got qualified to work with intensive care babies in the spring of 2015. Now, before that, there were only about 2 or 3 baby deaths per year on that unit. But in the summer of 2015, that number shot up. In June alone, 3 babies died within the space of 2 weeks. As the unexpected deaths continued, doctors and other healthcare workers at the hospital began suspecting Lucy, who was always on the floor when the babies died. Several staff went to hospital administrators with their concerns, but were brushed off, and even at one point forced to apologize to Lucy for harassing her. They also instructed the hospital staff not to contact anyone else, especially law enforcement, because apparently they were more concerned over the hospital's reputation than the lives of their patients. But as the deaths and near deaths of babies kept piling up, the staff finally had enough of the cover-up and called the police. Similar to the Beverley Allitt case, it was the presence of shockingly high levels of insulin in a victim's blood test that broke the case. Lucy was charged with 8 counts of murder and 10 counts of attempted murder. She'd used a variety of methods on her tiny victims: overdoses of insulin, injecting them with air, overfeeding them, and even, in some cases, physically assaulting them. Some of her victims survived her initial attacks, but she would then go back and attack them again, eventually killing them. Her trial lasted more than 10 months, the longest murder trial in British history. She was found guilty on 6 counts of attempted murder and 7 counts of murder. She was sentenced to 14 life terms. Since her arrest, most people assume she had Munchausen's by proxy, which is now called factitious disorder imposed on another, or FDIA. So let's look at a similar case of someone who actually does have FDIA, Beverley Allitt. Beverley was born in 1968 and raised in the small village of Corby Glen. Like Lucy, her home life didn't send up any red flags. There were no allegations of abuse or anything like that. Unlike Lucy's shy but bubbly personality, Beverly just seemed to be kind of dull. Where Lucy was described as a good student who went on to be the first in her family to attend college, Beverly wasn't, and actually failed the test she needed to pass in order to move on to a higher level school with her siblings. Her low grades seemed to be the result of missing a lot of class due to illnesses and injuries. And here's where we start to see the first symptoms of factitious disorder showing up. Classmates and family members recalled that she always needed to be the center of attention and would often fake being sick or injured in order to get it. She would also doctor hop until she found one who would go along with whatever she had diagnosed herself with. She used this technique to have her perfectly healthy appendix removed, then kept, quote, interfering with the surgical wound, causing it to take much longer to heal. Because she failed that school test, she dropped out at 16 and soon got a job at a local pub. While she was working there, she began a relationship with Steve Biggs. And here's where we start to see a really stark difference between her and Lucy. While Lucy's friends described her as being kind and gentle, Steve described his relationship with Beverly as abusive, as in she was abusing him. He says she would kick him, punch him, and verbally abuse him. She once faked a pregnancy in order to manipulate him into proposing to her, but he finally called it off after she kicked him in the testicles so hard he passed out. Lucy Letby had always known she wanted to be a nurse. Beverley Allitt, though, had to be convinced. At some point, Beverly met a former nurse who offered to help her study for her nursing exams. With the woman's help, she was able to just barely pass the entrance exam to get into nursing school. And as soon as she moved into the dorm there, odd things began to happen. Curtains mysteriously caught on fire, along with other odd and unexplained things. Feces were found in the refrigerator, in the oven, and once even smeared on the walls. And like before, Beverly was hardly ever in class. Instead, she was constantly in the nurse's office with some ailment or injury or something. The college nurses soon figured out what was causing most of her symptoms. For example, she injected saline into one of her breasts to make it inflamed and swallowed boiling water in order to fake a fever. Her frequent absences resulted in, unsurprisingly, failing to pass the certification tests. She had to take them several times before she finally passed, and even then, just barely. Thanks to that poor performance, she was the only member of her class who wasn't hired right after graduation. But Grantham and Kesteven, a small hospital that served the rural areas around Grantham, was desperate. It wasn't a particularly busy hospital, but in 1991, it was suffering from chronic understaffing. At first, the nursing manager, along with the ward sister, basically the charge nurse, had been against hiring her. But Ward 4, the pediatric ward, was so understaffed, they went ahead and hired her anyway. Even though she didn't have the right training to work with children, the staff on Ward 4 figured another pair of hands was better than nothing. And Beverly quickly ingratiated herself to the staff, always being helpful and volunteering for extra shifts when she was needed. And it seemed like her arrival came none too soon, as the normally steady ward soon got very, very busy. 4 days after she was hired, on February 21st, a 7-week-old boy, Liam Taylor, was admitted with a mild chest infection. Beverly was right there at Liam's bedside to reassure his parents, insisting they go home and get some rest. Within hours, Liam suffered a respiratory collapse, even though the monitors he was hooked up to never went off. But since she was with him at the time, she'd sounded the alarm right away. Staff were able to resuscitate him, but they were worried he might crash again. So she volunteered for extra night duty to watch over him. Just after midnight, Liam suffered another respiratory failure, but again was able to be pulled through it. Yet, as the night wore on, his condition worsened, and Liam suffered a cardiac arrest. Once again, the monitors had failed, so it was only thanks to Beverly's quick reflexes that the staff were alerted. This time, it took over an hour to revive Liam. Because he'd been deprived of oxygen for so long, he suffered severe brain damage, so he became dependent on life support. After some time, his parents had to make the heartbreaking decision to remove their son from life support. He died soon afterwards. The cause of death listed on Liam's death certificate stated he had suffered a heart attack. Dr. Charith Naniakara, the pediatric doctor on staff at the time, was suspicious of that diagnosis, since the weeks-old baby had no previous history of heart problems. He also thought it was odd that the monitors had failed to alert during any of his attacks. So he wrote to the medical examiner stating his suspicions and requesting a post-mortem exam to be performed. His request was ignored. Once the tragedy of losing little Liam had passed, the nurses and staff on Ward 4 started noticing other strange happenings. Some of them noticed things had gone missing from their lockers or purses, and the key to the medicine closet had disappeared as well. Maybe just not wanting to make a fuss, they just replaced the key and went on with their jobs. They didn't have much time to think about it anyway, as only 2 weeks after Liam's death, 11-year-old Timothy Hardwick was admitted to Ward 4 after he'd suffered a seizure at school. Since Timothy had cerebral palsy, he was noted to need special care. The head nurse asked Beverley to look after him while she went on her rounds. But before she could even finish the rounds, the head nurse was called back to Timothy's room. He had stopped breathing and was turning blue. Despite their best efforts, Timothy died on March 5, 1991. 5 days later, 15-month-old Kaylee Desmond was admitted for a chest infection. She then suffered not one, but 2 cardiac arrests. After her second cardiac arrest, she was transferred to a larger hospital in nearby Nottingham. While there, she did recover, although she was left with severe physical and developmental disabilities. The staff at this hospital noticed a puncture mark under her arm and an air bubble beneath it. They assumed it was a result of an accidental injection, so it wasn't investigated. And the tragedies kept coming. On March 20th, 5-month-old Paul Crampton was brought in with a chest cold. Paul was in good spirits and seemed to be doing well other than the cough. But within hours of his arrival, he stopped breathing and his heart had stopped. Dr. Naniakara saw the boy's symptoms, pale, sweaty, listless, and ordered a glucose injection. Paul recovered immediately. The day after that, 2 more patients suffered serious attacks. 5-year-old Bradley Gibson, who was in the hospital with pneumonia, and 2-year-old Yik Hung Chan, known as Henry, who had a slight skull fracture. Bradley suffered 2 cardiac arrests before being transferred to Nottingham, and Henry suffered 2 respiratory attacks before also being transferred to Nottingham. But thankfully, they both recovered. As Beverley left to go off duty for the next 3 days, the staff kept a close eye on Paul Crampton, who seemed to be doing fine, and there were no other serious problems on the ward. After those 3 days were over, Dr. Naniakara told Paul's parents they could take their son home. But they were still worried after the 2 mysterious attacks, so they asked to stay another day just to be safe. You know, like you can in a country where you don't go bankrupt because of a hospital visit. The next day, when Beverley was back on duty, she was ordered to remove Paul's IV so he could be released. While she was doing that, he suffered yet another hypoglycemic attack. This time, staff sent him to Nottingham, but not after Dr. Naniakara took a blood sample. He was determined to find out what was causing these mysterious attacks. Fortunately, Paul was able to recover and had no more issues. Now, the staff at Grantham and Kesteven were beginning to get suspicious. For 6 children to suffer such dramatic health collapses, and for 2 of them to die within the space of 2 months was far from normal. They wondered if maybe there was some unknown illness circulating within the community, or even inside the hospital. As Dr. Naniakara waited on Paul Crampton's blood tests, more children kept having serious attacks. Becky Phillips, just 2 months old, admitted April 1st with a mild case of gastroenteritis, suffered a hypoglycemic attack. Her parents later took her home, where her condition worsened until she passed away that night. The Phillipses then brought in Becky's twin sister, Katie, as a precaution, and Beverley was put in charge of her care. Soon, she too had an attack and stopped breathing. She was revived, then later suffered another attack. Katie was transferred to Queen's Medical Center, where she recovered. But exams showed 5 fractured ribs, known as squeeze fractures. Staff there assumed it had been the result of CPR, so no investigation was done. Katie survived, but was left with serious brain damage, partial paralysis, and partial blindness. 6-year-old Michael Davidson was admitted a few days later for post-operative recovery. He seemed to be doing well until, after one of his regularly scheduled antibiotic injections administered by Beverley, he began having a seizure and stopped breathing. Thankfully, he made a full recovery. Then on April 22nd, 15-month-old Claire Peck was admitted for an asthma treatment. While the doctor was out of the room talking with her parents, Claire was left with Beverley. Within minutes, Claire went into respiratory failure. She was resuscitated, and once she'd been stabilized, the doctor stepped out of the room to once again try to speak with her parents, leaving her in Beverley's care. Once again, within minutes, Claire had another attack. This time, though, she could not be saved. A post-mortem exam was done on baby Claire, and tests revealed abnormally high levels of potassium in her system, something that in high enough levels can cause heart arrhythmia and death. Now, with clear evidence of foul play, the hospital administrators took their suspicions to the police in May of 1991. Police Superintendent Stuart Clifton was put in charge of the investigation. Looking over the medical charts of the children who had suffered attacks, he suspected there was a serial killer on Ward 4. First, he ordered the exhumation of Claire Peck. Tests showed not only high levels of potassium, but also the presence of lignocaine, a drug used to treat cardiac arrest in adults. It is never used on infants. Now, even more certain there was foul play at work, Clifton began questioning the staff of Ward 4. None of them seemed suspicious, though there was the matter of the missing medicine cabinet key. It was last known to have been in Beverley's possession, though she claimed she'd given it to another nurse whose name she couldn't recall. Clifton's team made up a chart showing who was on duty during each of the children's attacks. In every single instance, Beverley was not only on duty, but was present in the room when the attack occurred. Police brought her in for questioning, but she insisted that she was innocent. She even tried denying she'd been on duty during some of the attacks, despite other staff saying that she was. Suspiciously, the allocation notebook, or duty roster, had several pages ripped out of it, specifically for the dates when the children suffered attacks. But without any concrete evidence, they couldn't arrest Beverley yet. But Clifton begged the hospital administrators not to allow her near any patients. The hospital agreed and suspended her from duty. Her co-workers were stunned. They couldn't believe the friendly, helpful young nurse could be guilty of something so horrific. Several of the parents of children who'd suffered attacks also came to her defense, since she'd been the first one to notice problems and had worked so hard to save her patients. No one could believe she would harm children. Even Dr. Nani Yakara couldn't believe a nurse would harm her patients. But now that Beverley was no longer on the ward, the mysterious attacks stopped. Meanwhile, Clifton's team of investigators was working on finding the evidence they needed to bring charges. When they learned that several of her alleged victims had been transferred to Nottingham University Hospital, they went there to go through the children's records at that hospital. For once, luck was on their side. Hospitals in the UK routinely take blood samples of their patients, but they only store them for a short period of time. However, the nurse in charge just hadn't gotten around to discarding the samples yet. So investigators went through hundreds of them, eventually finding samples from 9 of the 13 children who'd suffered attacks while on Beverley's watch. The samples were sent for analysis, which would take weeks. Anyway, now she was out of work, Beverley moved out of her apartment and in with a friend, Tracy Jobson, and her family. However, soon after she moved in, strange things started happening at the Jobsons' home. One day, Tracy's brother, Jonathan, found bleach in his bed. Another time, the family dog began to foam at the mouth and have convulsions after Beverley fed him some pills. Then, one day when the Jobson family had gone to the market, Jonathan started feeling dizzy and sweating. He passed out, so they took him to the hospital, where it was determined he was suffering from hypoglycemic shock. The last thing he remembered doing before the attack was drinking some juice Beverley had given him. After that, the Jobsons had had enough. They called the police on her. Eventually, the children's blood tests came back, and there was no longer any doubt that they had been attacked. Paul Crampton's blood was shown to have over 43,000 milliunits of insulin in his blood, one of the highest levels ever found in a human being. Her other victims had shockingly high levels of insulin or potassium in their systems. Some had been killed or injured by other means, such as Katie Phillips, who had been squeezed to death, or Kaylee Desmond, who'd been injected with air, causing her lung to collapse. Beverley Allitt was arrested on July 26, 1991. A search of her house revealed the missing allocation notebook pages as well as a used syringe. She was formally charged with 4 counts of murder, 11 counts of attempted murder, and 11 counts of causing grievous bodily harm. While awaiting trial, she lost a lot of weight and developed an eating disorder. As usual, she complained of various illnesses, causing her trial to be delayed multiple times. But on February 15, 1993, she could delay no longer. Her trial lasted nearly 4 months, most of it without her in the courtroom, since she claimed to be too sick to attend. At trial, psychologists told the jury Beverley had Munchausen syndrome, now called factitious disorder, in which someone injures or induces symptoms on themselves in order to gain attention. Psychologists testified that she then escalated to Munchausen syndrome by proxy, or factitious disorder imposed on another, in which someone injures or induces symptoms in someone else, usually someone under their care, in order to gain attention and sympathy for themselves. Despite the prosecution's solid case against her, she maintained her innocence. But the jury didn't buy it. On May 28, 1993, she was found guilty of 4 counts of murder, 3 attempted murders, and 6 counts of grievous bodily injury. She was sentenced to 13 life sentences with a minimum of 30 years. But only 1 week into her sentence, she was transferred to Rampton Secure Hospital after prison officials determined she was at risk of self-harm. Since Rampton is a hospital and not a prison, patients there have a lot more freedom. Beverley was given a private room with a television and even allowed out for shopping trips. Needless to say, the victim's family and the community at large were outraged by this, believing that she was once again faking illness in order to get special treatment. Again, in 2018, it was reported that she developed a near-fatal case of sepsis. And though the hospital never released any of her records or any other information, it's probably safe to assume this was yet another self-inflicted illness to gain attention. Needless to say, anyone who remembers the Beverley Allitt case is going to draw parallels with the Lucy Letby case. But while Beverley was a textbook example of FDIA, Lucy just doesn't fit the profile, at least from what we know so far. There's no record of her faking illness in herself or anyone else for attention, or really any attention-seeking behaviors at all. She also didn't position herself as a savior after attacking her victims like Beverley Allitt did. As for motive, forensic psychologist Dr. Indra Kin puts these medical serial killers into 6 categories. Visionaries. This is a really rare type of serial killer that's psychotic and is driven to kill by visions or delusions. One example is Herbert Mullen, who killed 13 people because he thought he was preventing an earthquake. Missionaries are killers who try to rid the world of people they see as immoral or unworthy. One example of that would be Thomas Cream, a doctor in late 1800s England, who killed the sex workers who came to him for abortions. Thrill seekers, which is pretty self-explanatory. Lust killers who get sexual pleasure from murder. Michael Swango and Jane Toppin are examples of this one. Gain motivated. These people kill for psychological or financial gain, like relieving the killer of the burden of caring for the victim, or to steal money or valuables. This can also take the form of FDIA, like with Beverley Allitt. Finally, power and control-oriented killers kill to exert power over their victims. This is the category that forensic psychologists put Lucy Letby into. According to the forensic psychologists who've been studying her case, she apparently got off on the power and control of having someone's life in her hands. They believe she got a thrill from exerting that control over her victims, and then from seeing their parents' trauma and heartbreak afterwards. That power-seeking became an addiction, and when she was able to get away with it over and over again, that just encouraged her to keep doing it. So what do you think about the Lucy Letby case or Beverley Allitt? And would you like me to cover more medical serial killers? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy deep dives like this, be sure and subscribe for more terrible stories. Till next time.